Welcome to Two Dudes Podcast, where history gets weird, wild, and maybe a little sinister. I'm Teddy, your go-to guy for questionable history takes. And with me, as always, is my partner in intellectual crime, Blair.
That's right. I'm Blair, the dude who brings just enough skepticism to keep Teddy from going off the rails. Today, we're stepping into the foggy, gaslit streets of Victorian London to tackle one of history's creepiest and most misunderstood stories, Jack the Ripper.
Now, before you roll your eyes and think, oh no, not another true crime retelling. Wait, we're doing this a little bit differently. Instead of just focusing on the gruesome murders and ominous letters, we're going to dive into the society that created the legend. Because let's face it, Victorian England was an absolute mess.
Yeah, I mean, come on. It's not just about who was Jack the Ripper. It's about why society let him become a mythic figure. We'll explore how feminist movements of the time, the clash between traditional values and progressivism, and how sensationalist media, or as we call today, clickbait, played a role in making Jack the Ripper infamous.
And let's not forget about the victims, real women with real stories, who often get overshadowed by the monster in the fog. We're going to dig into how class, gender, and good old Victorian hypocrisy shaped their lives, and how these issues still echo in today's conversations about violence against women and their media ethics.
So grab your top hat, pour yourself a cup of tea, or maybe something stronger, and get ready for a wild ride through Victorian London. Because this isn't just about history. It's about how we, as a society, create villains, glorify chaos, and sometimes just forget the human cost of it all. So, in the late 1800s, England's undergoing significant social change. On one hand, you had growing feminist movements pushing for women's rights, especially the right to vote, with suffragettes leading the charge. But at the same time, Victorian society was deeply entrenched in traditional roles for women. Kind of have this clash between progressivism and traditionalism. And women were often expected to be confined to the home, to be pure and domestic, and anything that challenged that view was often met with scorn, especially when it came to issues around sex work.
Right. And when we talk about prostitutes in this period, it's important to understand that the term wasn't just about choice. It was often about survival. For many women, especially those from lower social classes, sex work was one of the few ways to make a living. Women had very limited opportunities for economic independence. But today, we view sex work through a different lens, increasingly recognizing it as a labor issue and advocating for workers' rights and safety. Back in the Victorian era, though prostitutes were seen as a much more moralistic light, often regarded as fallen women.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what kind of brings us to our point about the Contagious Disease Act of the 1860s. Contagious Disease Act really just highlights the discriminatory nature of how society treated sex workers. The law gave police the power to forcibly examine women suspected of being prostitutes in an effort to try and curb the spread of sexual diseases. This act was deeply controversial and fiercely opposed by the feminist groups, and they argued that it was just utterly unfair to target poor women and violate their rights.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. The law wasn't just about public health. It was also controlling women's bodies, particularly working-class women. And that speaks to the broader idea of the new woman emerging at this time. The new woman was independent, often more sexually liberated, and very different from the traditional image of the domestic, submissive Victorian lady. She was a direct challenge to conservative gender norms.
Yeah, and that's just the real point of tension. Victorian society was built on a deep sense of traditionalism, very keen on the fact of their robust gender roles and moral codes. Now you have this new woman that's disrupting all of the traditionalist notions at the time and kind of symbolizing a new kind of progressivism, one that threatened to disrupt the social order. And then this question kind of came. Could society move forward without losing its sense of moral purity?
And that's kind of where you see the real divide between traditionalism and progressivism at play. The growing social movements in favor of women's rights and equality were pushing back against the older, more rigid social structures. But that push for change wasn't easy. It collided directly with a class system that worked to keep people in their place, especially those in poverty. Nowhere was this more visible than in the slums of Whitechapel, where, surprisingly, Jack the Ripper's crime took place.
Whitechapel was very poor. It was overcrowded, and it was a home to a significant population of working class women, many of whom were forced into this way of life of sex work just to survive. The contrast between their lives and the lives of wealthier classes was stark. For the upper class, it was just unthinkable that people could even climb the social ladder, and this protected them. There was this notion of social purity that was backed by the upper class and basically meant that the upper class believed that they had this superior moral responsibility to protect society from what they saw as the dangerous underclass.
Yeah, and that mindset kind of fueled a lot of fear and stigmatization of the poor. The working class women in Whitechapel, especially the victims of the Ripper, were often seen not just as victims of the crime, but as symbols of moral decay. And this perception played into how the Ripper case was sort of covered by the media. And this is going to bring us into the role of yellow journalism. It's a topic we talked about a bunch, and it sensationalized news stories that often exaggerate or fabricate details to sell papers, which we think was very apparent in this case.
For sure. And this media frenzy around the Ripper case was intense. The infamous Jack the Ripper letters are a prime example of how the press sensationalized the case. Some of the letters that were supposedly written by Ripper were definitely hoaxes designed to stir up fear and curiosity. But whether they were real or not, which we have no idea to this day, they played a massive role in keeping the public engaged and frightened, feeding into the idea that the killer was not just a criminal, but almost a mythical figure.
Yeah, and the sensationalization is absurd. These accounts are almost always tied back to class fears. The Ripper murders, because they're involved working class women, sort of highlighted the social inequalities of the time. The victims were often portrayed in the media as tragic figures, but also sort of as symbols of the dangers posed by the lower classes. And for the wealthy, these murders were a reminder of the perceived chaos brewing in the slums.
Yeah, so how are people kind of understanding these victims? Everyone views these sex workers as very immoral women that are in need of this punishment. The newspapers producing content that sold a bad story of all these women and sex workers, and we only see libertarians at the time even considering these women to be human. And on the domestic side, like Teddy said earlier, there's just this constant fear that's being instilled amongst the lower class and women in general of being hurt or a victim of sexual assault. We're seeing husbands say to their wives that they're going to Whitechapel them and reinstituting these male power dynamics that traditionalists aim so hard to really implement.
Yeah, so we're going to change the flow a little bit and kind of talk about the idea of Jack the Ripper. So we talked about it earlier, but yellow journalism was a term coined post Jack the Ripper, but it perfectly captures the style of the time. The idea of yellow journalism is to grab attention through lurid headlines, exaggerated stories, and graphic details, which kind of encapsulates the story in itself. News outlets sought to shock and enthrall, not just inform in this time, and it was sort of creating an emotional reaction. And with Jack the Ripper, they hit the jackpot.
For sure. And the press was a business, and sensational stories sold papers. Jack the Ripper's murders, brutal, mysterious, and unsolved, were perfect for this kind of media exploitation. The news didn't just report on the killings, they created the narrative. They turned a series of murders into citywide, even nationwide spectacle.
And you know what's fascinating, Blair, is just how this all played into Victorian fears, so as we've reiterated around the entire podcast. London was already a city of contrasts. Immense wealth beside crushing poverty in Whitechapel, the rise of industrialization, and a just completely changing social fabric. The Ripper crimes happened in the East End among the poorest of London's population, but the newspapers didn't focus on poverty or class issues. They sort of altered their story to focus on fear and mystery. They're obsessed with the idea of an anonymous, dangerous figure who could strike at any time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, while we don't know if Jack the Ripper was the one formulating these letters to the media, we can see just through the diction of the letters that there was just this gravitation towards instilling fear. From one of the letters we see in quotes, "Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again." It just gruesome details that were plastered everywhere. Mutilated bodies, throat slashed, organs removed, and the press didn't just inform, they entertained the readers with fear and morbid fascination.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the media was just sort of blaring out that these murders were happening and kind of not really digging into what was going on, sort of just encapsulating people to read the media rather than actually report on the findings. Yeah, so in the creation of this myth, the interesting thing about the media's portrayal of Jack is sort of how they built up the myth around him. At first, the police force had absolutely no leads, and the press didn't wait for answers. They even started creating their own. They sort of just speculated on his identity, his background, his motivations, even inventing clues and evidence that didn't exist.
Yeah, and they played into public's desire for a villain. Jack the Ripper wasn't just any murderer. He was depicted as almost this mythical figure. Cunning, elusive, terrifying. Newspapers ran stories that made him sound almost like a phantom. For example, they often hinted that Ripper was someone from the upper class, perhaps a doctor or even royalty. They gave him an air of sophistication and mystery, something that the public just couldn't latch onto.
Yeah, and this notion of a highly educated, possibly upper class killer was central to the sensationalized narrative. It played into class anxieties and added an element of danger that wasn't just about the victims, but sort of encapsulated more of the society of itself. If the Ripper could be one of us, then who could be safe?
I mean, the media they really pushed a powerful narrative. The police, despite their best efforts, couldn't solve the case. And so the media stepped in to create a character who is both criminal and a symbol of societal dread. The Ripper was no longer just a man with a knife. He was this ominous figure of terror that transcended the reality of his crimes.
Yeah, I'm going to circle back to those letters that Blair mentioned and also kind of about creating a myth. We can't talk about the media without mentioning the famous Ripper letters. The letters were often published in newspapers, supposedly sent by the killer himself, which were taunting the police and the public. And they're also presented as pieces of evidence, yet many historians believe most, if not all, of them are hoaxes.
Right. And of these letters, the From Hell letter is the most notorious or most talked about of them all. It's signed by Jack the Ripper himself, and in it, the writer goes on to describe very gruesome, vile, just horrible details that seem to only feed the public's obsession. I guess in modern day terms, you kind of have this correlation between Ripper and maybe a figure like Jeffrey Dahmer. There's just this weird fascination about these murders, and in the context of Ripper, whether the letters were genuine or not, the media treated them as a gospel, enhancing the mystery and horror.
Yeah, and these letters weren't just taunting police. They're also about feeding the public's desire for interaction with the killer. It turned the Ripper into a media spectacle, a figure who wasn't just out there committing crimes, but one who was actively engaging with the public. This was the media making Jack the Ripper a part of the public's life, keeping the mystery alive and feeding the frenzy.
Yeah, I mean, The media is not just reporting the news, they're shaping it, twisting it, and in many ways creating the world in which Ripper existed and flourished. They turned the case into a puzzle, basically an open-ended mystery, and gave way for everyone to kind of speculate about it. People didn't want the answers. They needed the mystery to continue. Now let's just take a moment to consider who was consuming all of this media. The press, as it was in the late 19th century, wasn't as widely accessible to all classes. Most of the sensational coverage about Jack the Ripper and other major events was geared toward the wealthier class. They just basically could get their hands on it way easier than that of the lower class.
Yeah, and we've hammered that point time and time again. And while the working class in London had access to some newspapers, it wasn't really the affluent members of society. Sort of the upper and middle upper classes who were the primary consumers of the sensational news surrounding the Ripper. This was a time when literacy rates were increasing, but the wealthier class still dominated the media landscape.
Yeah, and these newspaper, especially the more sensational ones, they often catered to the tastes and fears of the upper class. We talked about earlier how most of these Ripper cases were aimed to keep the traditionalist values and enforce those societal norms that have, accelerated the upper class's concentration for some time and time. And now the tone of these papers wasn't just about reporting the news, it was about creating the narratives that reinstated the anxieties, and particularly around morality, class, and crime.
Yeah, and also the focus on the Ripper's crimes in the East End, particularly in Whitechapel, was part of that narrative. Whitechapel was sort of what people would call the underbelly of London, where just poverty, crime, and vice were just rampant in this sort of cultural hot pot. For the wealthier classes, the Ripper story was just a way to feed in their fears of the lower classes and the perceived moral decay of society. These sensationalized stories painted the East End as a dangerous place, further cementing class divides.
Yeah, just kind of unfair because the fact of the matter is you had the poor people in the East End who were most affected by these crimes. We have 5 women die under, their feet, their noses, and it's just the wealthier individuals who are able to consume this media that's reporting on these crimes. The media was perpetrating a narrative of fear that was mostly divorced from the reality of the working class experience. And you just have these wealthy folks reading the stories, not because they were personally in danger, because it was just something that they were fascinated by. And they could, relish in the social implications of these crimes.
Yeah, and this outreached way past just the East End. It reinforced a certain worldwide view. The sensational stories about the Ripper were not just about entertainment, but about maintaining sort of a social order or an old social norm. And the press obviously highlighted the dangers of the lower classes, framing them as criminal and dangerous. It was a subtle but very powerful and effective way of reinforcing the notion that the wealthy were civilized while the poor were beneath them and somehow responsible for their own plight.
Yeah, just the structure of the society in itself highlights that. You have the underworld, and then you have the wealthy. You have the slums, and then you have just the beauty of the wealthy areas in London. And in a way, the wealthy were able just to consume the narratives of terror and danger from the comfort of their drawing rooms. And they're just so separated from where these crimes are taking place.
Yeah, so we're going to shift the podcast once more and kind of talk about the effects that it has on current day media sensationalism and portrayal and how this story could affect our lives and scandals for the future. So sort of overall the case, it's just incredible how they set the stage for today's sensational crime reporting, such as true crime podcasts, as you see on Spotify, TikTok, and all that stuff. Sort of these Ripper murders have created a public hunger for gruesome details and mystery. That legacy is still very much alive and well in today's media, and we sort of see constant coverage of violent crimes, especially those that are unsolved or have a mysterious element, and they're kind of portrayed in the media as something that you consume for entertainment rather than look at the gruesome details. And they're packaged with kind of details that'll heighten fear just to keep people hooked. And what's crucial is that the media feeds into a fear-based narrative. It's not just about reporting crime, it's about crafting a story that sort of elevates this fear and taps into the public fascination and plays on the desire for mystery that's kind of grown over time. And that has become the blueprint for how we consume true crime today through documentaries, news reports, and all other sensationalized stories.
Yeah, so it's just kind of become a culture, I would say, that has been sustained over time. But it's not just like this mystery of gruesome detail that has lingered. It's kind of been like the way the media has framed the victims of Jack the Ripper. What's the continuing influence of that, do you think, Teddy?
I think the way that Ripper's victims were portrayed in the media is just still very relevant today, like we've said. And at the time, these women were described as prostitutes, which we don't really know, but they're victims of their own moral failings is kind of how the media portrayed them. And this framing that they got sort of reinforced the narrative of vulnerability tied to gender, which suggested that women, especially working class women, were always at risk. Fast forward to today, and we still see women being portrayed as helpless victims of violent crime in the media, often emphasizing the gender dynamics of vulnerability. There's this persistent stereotype that women are somehow more susceptible to danger, especially at the hands of men. And this narrative has been ingrained in our culture through decades of media portrayals, starting with this case.
Yeah, and that idea of women as victims seems to be paired with the ongoing narrative of men as predators, reinforcing the notion that the world is this dangerous place, especially for women. But there's also this issue of class in the story. How did the media coverage of Jack the Ripper tie into the class dynamics of what the lasting effects of that?
Yeah, the media coverage from the Ripper case sort of painted Whitechapel as a place of danger, disorder, and immortality. It wasn't just about the murder themselves, it was about the neighborhood. The focus on the poor criminals area tied crime to class and further reinforced the stereotype that we talk about that poverty breeds criminality. Today, the same exact media framing can be seen when crime stories focused on impoverished neighborhoods, suggesting a direct link between class and criminal behavior. It sort of oversimplifies the issue and ignores the structural favors like systematic inequality and lack of access to resources. The lingering effect here is that we still associate crime with certain areas, often working class or marginalized communities. The media's role in this continues to shape how society views crime, often overlooking the broader, more complex factors at play.
And that idea of crime leads to something that is still relevant to today. The idea of fear. The Ripper case didn't just heighten fear of crime, it created an enduring culture of fear that impacts how we live our daily lives. People are and were terrified by the idea of an unknown killer, and that fear is stuck. Even today, crime stories with an element of mystery are the unknown continue to captivate the public.
Right, Blair. The unsolved nature of the case played a huge role in cementing his place as a figure of mystery and fear, sort of that idea that we reiterate. It wasn't just about the murders. It was about the uncertainty of who the killer was and whether he could strike again. That fear, fueled by the media, lingers today in how we view crime. We often focus on the most terrifying possibilities, the ones that make for the most compelling stories. And as a result, we may overestimate the actual danger, allowing fear to shape our perceptions and behaviors. The legacy of the Ripper's case is that it still continues to influence how crime is sensationalized. It's not just about facts anymore. It's about the stories we tell, the narratives that make crime more thrilling, more sinister, and more terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, it just really seems that Jack the Ripper didn't just change how the media covers crime in the short term. it really, hardened a lasting cultural shift. The media didn't just report on the murders, it created a fear based narrative that still influences how we view crime and gender and class and that interplay today.
And what's often overlooked is how these portrayals reinforce deep-rooted gender and class stereotypes, which affect how society responds to crime. The Ripper case may have been one of the first to demonstrate how powerful the media's influence could be on shaping our fears, perceptions, and even our attitudes toward victims and criminals.
Yeah, that's just a powerful point. But when we look back at the Ripper case, we're not just seeing the story of one man and his victims. We're seeing this foundation of media culture that continues to impact our understanding of crime, fear, and just overall justice to the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really important to recognize that while the methods may have evolved, the patterns in media coverage remain. The Ripper case was just the beginning of a broader cultural shift, one that we're still navigating today through just essentially different forms of media consumption.
And with that, that wraps up this segment of Two Dudes Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Teddy, you got any final remarks?
Yeah, so hope you guys could take something away from this. I think analyzing the effects over time and sort of in this space of Jack the Ripper's case and Whitechapel itself have really shaped who we are today and how we perceive scandals in the future. And through listening to this podcast, and if you can take anything away from it, it's that don't always believe what the media says. So thank you guys for listening, and I hope you have a great holiday. See ya. Two Dudes out.